My wife's family thought I was a freeloader. At her sister's wedding, her mom shouted, "Who invited you here? You can never be part of us." My wife asked me to apologize, but I refused immediately and left the place. The next day I made sure they never forgot what I did to them. The ballroom glittered like a chandelier caught in a storm of light. Crystal flutes, clinking silk, dresses rustling, and laughter spilling over the edges of polite restraint. It was my wife, sister's wedding reception, a spectacle of excess that could have funded a small nation's dreams. White roses cascaded from every table, their scent cloying enough to choke a man who preferred the open air. I stood near the back, nursing a glass of bourbon I hadn't touched, watching the crowd swirl like moss around the flame of wealth. My wife, Elena, glowed in the center of it all, her auburn hair catching the light as she laughed with her sister, the bride. She belonged there, radiant and untouchable. I didn't, and that was fine by me until it wasn't. The band struck up a waltz, and the guests parted like a tide, revealing my mother-in-law, Margaret, striding toward the microphone with the grace of a general storming a battlefield. Her silver gown shimmered, but her eyes were cold steel, scanning the room until they locked on me. I felt the weight of her gaze before she even opened her mouth. Predator sizing up prey it deemed unworthy. I straightened my tie, simple, black, nothing like the gaudy peacock feathers the other men wore, and waited. I'd seen her venom before, but never like this. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice slicing through the music like a guillotine. The band faltered, then stopped. "We're here to celebrate my daughter's union, a day of joy and family." She paused, her lips curling into something that wasn't a smile. "But I have to ask, who invited you here?" Her fingers stabbed the air, pointing straight at me. A gasp rippled through the crowd, heads swiveling like puppets on strings. "You gulking in the shadows like some beggar at the gate. You can never be part of us." The words landed like a slap, sharp and public, going off the gilded walls. My jaw tightened, but I didn't flinch. The room buzzed whispers, stifled laughs, the clink of glasses as people leaned in for the show. Elena's face drained of color, her eyes darting between me and her mother. Margaret stood triumphant, chin high, as if she just purged a stain from her pristine lineage. I could have laughed at the irony if it didn't burn so damn much. They thought I was nothing, a leech clinging to Elena's supposed fortune. They didn't know I could buy this venue, the catering, and every soul in it twice over, and still have change to burn. I set my glass down, the soft thud louder in my ears than the murmurs around me. "Margaret," I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the noise, "you've made your point." I turned to leave, crowd parting like I carried a plague. Elena rushed after me, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "James, wait," she hissed, grabbing my arm just outside the ballroom doors. The air in the corridor was cooler, free of perfume and pretense, but her touch felt like a shackle. "You can't just walk out like that." She didn't mean it. She's just drunk. Upset about the wedding costs, upset enough to humiliate me in front of 200 people. Pulled my arm free, meeting her wide, pleading eyes up close. She was still beautiful, her freckles faint under the flush of panic. She meant every word. Elena and her hands twisted together. A habit from our early days when she'd been nervous about meeting. My quiet, unassuming self back then thought it endearing. Now it just looked weak. "Please," she said, voice trembling. "Go back in there. Apologize to her." For me, I stared at her, the woman I'd married 3 years ago under a sky too blue to promise storms. Apologize for existing, for daring to stand beside her while her family sneered. The bourbon I hadn't drunk churned in my gut. A phantom heat. "No." I said the word flat and final. "I don't gravel." Her mouth opened, then closed, fish-like and helpless. I didn't wait for more. I walked out into the night, the valley, scrambling to fetch my car, a modest sedan I'd chosen over the Bentleys. I could have driven. The engine purred to life, and I gripped the wheel, the leather cool against my palms. In the rearview mirror, the venue shrank, its lights blurring into a smear of gold. My phone buzzed. Elena, no doubt. I let it ring. She'd chosen her side long before tonight. Even if she didn't realize it, the drive home was a haze of city lights and rage beneath it. Something colder took root. They thought I was nothing. Marguerite with her venomous tongue, Elena with her spineless plea, her sister smirking through her veil, and the rest of that clan dripping in borrowed arrogance. They built their world on assumptions. Elena's inheritance, her father's old money, never guessing I'd been the one quietly paying their bills, funding their excess through back channels they'd never traced. I'd stayed in the shadows because I liked it there, letting Elena shine while I worked unseen. My wealth wasn't a trophy, it was a tool. Now it would be a weapon. Pulled into the driveway of our house, hearse technically in their eyes, though I had paid off the mortgage years ago. The lights were off. The silence is stark contrast to the chaos I'd left. Inside, I poured a real drink, the amber liquid catching the moonlight through the window. My sister's number glowed on my phone screen as I dialed. She picked up on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the hour. "James, what's wrong?" "They crossed the line tonight, Sarah," I said, swirling the glass. "Margaret, Elena, all of them. They think I'm dirt under their feet." Pause, then a low chuckle. "Big mistake." "What's the play?" I leaned back, the plan forming like a storm cloud on the horizon. "They'll beg me to come back tomorrow. I'll let them think they've won. Then I'll take it all apart. Piece by piece." Sarah's laugh was sharp, approving. "Good. I'll start moving things on my end. They won't know what hit them." I hung up, staring into the dark. Margaret's words replayed. "You can never be part of us." She was right, but not for the reason she thought. I wasn't one of them and I never would be, but I'd make damn sure they felt the weight of what they'd lost. The bourbon burned going down, promise sealed in fire. They drew the day, they tried to bury me. The morning sun sliced through the blinds like a guillotine, cutting sharp lines across the hardwood floor of the living room. I hadn't slept. The bourbon glass sat empty on the coffee table, a silent witness to the hours I'd spent pacing, plotting, letting the rage harden into something useful. My phone buzzed incessantly, Elena's name flashing 6 times before I silenced it. She'd be here soon. I knew, dragging her family's crocodile tears behind her. They'd come begging, not because they were sorry, because they had smelled blood in the water and thought it was mine. They were wrong. The doorbell chimed a polite little trill that didn't match the storm brewing behind it. I smoothed my shirt, plain unstarched, the kind of thing they had mocked me for, and opened the door. Elena stood there, her eyes red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a hasty bun that betrayed her sleepless night too. Behind her loomed Margaret, her silver gown swapped for a crisp blazer, the same imperious tell to her chin. Flanking them were Elaine, his sister Clara, the blushing bride, and her new husband, a wiry man named Trevor, whose suit screamed inherited money. He hadn't earned a full delegation. Perfect. "James," Elena started, her voice soft, rehearsed. "Can we come in? We need to talk." I stepped aside, letting them file in like mourners at a funeral. They didn't yet know it was theirs. Margaret's heels clicked with purpose, her gaze sweeping the room as if she owned it. Clara clutched Trevor's arm, her wedding glow dimmed by the tension, a gesture to the sofa. They stayed standing, a united front of unease. "Good. Let them squirm." "We owe you an apology," Elena said, her hands twisting together in that old nervous tick. "Last night got out of hand. Mother was upset. The wine went to her head." I cut in, keeping my tone even, curious. She seemed pretty clear to me. "You can never be part of us. Hardin is here." That over a microphone? Margaret's lips thinned, but she stepped forward, her voice dripping with forced warmth. "It was a misunderstanding. James, weddings are emotional. I didn't mean to single you out. You're family after all." Family. The word landed like a brick, heavy with lies. I almost laughed, but instead I tilted my head, studying her family. I echoed, "Funny way of showing it." Trevor cleared his throat, jumping in with the eagerness of a man who thought he could fix anything with a handshake. "Look, mate, we all got off on the wrong foot. Clara and I want to start fresh. Maybe you could come to the brunch tomorrow, smooth things over." I let the silence stretch, watching their faces tighten. Clara's eyes flicked to Elena, pleading for backup. Margaret jot witch, a crack in her armor. They weren't here to mend fences. They were here to test me, to see if I bend. I give them what they wanted, just not the way they expected. "All right," I said finally, letting my shoulders slump a fraction, my voice soften. "I'll come to the brunch, no hard feelings." I even managed a small, tight smile, the kind a beaten dog might offer its master. Their relief was palpable. Elena's exhale, Margaret's smug nod, Trevor's quick grin. They thought they'd won me over, tamed the stray idiots. Elena crossed the room, touching my arm. "Thank you, James. This means a lot." Her fingers lingered, a ghost of the intimacy we'd once had. I didn't pull away, let her think she still had a hold. As they left, Margaret lingered at the door, her eyes narrowing. "You're a good man for this," she said, a faint edge to her tone. Not everyone would be so forgiving. Test, maybe, or a warning. I just nodded, closing the door behind her with a soft click that felt like a lock-snapping shot. The house fell silent again, but my mind was anything. But I pulled out my laptop, the screen's glow casting shadows across my face, as I logged into accounts they'd never dreamed. I owned a memory flickered 5 years ago, sitting in a cramped diner with Sarah, counting loose change to split a coffee while we sketched out our first real estate deal. We'd flipped a rundown warehouse into a gold mine, then a dozen more. I kept it quiet, funneling profits through shell companies, letting Elena shine as the wealthy one. While I stayed the humble shadow, her family's old money had dried up long ago. They just didn't know I had been propping them up, paying off their debts through discreet favors. Until now. My phone rang. "Sarah," I answered, leaning back in my chair. "They just left," I said, hook, line, and sinker. Her laugh was a razor's edge. "They're predictable." "What's next?" "They think I'm broken," I said, scrolling through a list of their financial ties. Clara's boutique, Trevor's failing startup, Margaret charity. That was more slush, fun than goodwill. I'll play along. Go to their damn brunch. Meanwhile you start pulling strings. The boutique's lease is up next month. Let it lapse. Trevor's investors spook them. Done. She said, her voice, all business and your assets, start the transfers quietly. I want it all in your name by the time this blows up. She paused and asked Elena too. I hesitated, the memory of her touch still warm on my arm. 3 years ago she'd laughed at my bad cooking, kissed me under a rain-soaked dawning, promised me forever. But last night she'd chosen them over me, even if she didn't see it that way. I said finally too. Sarah didn't push. I'll handle it. Watch your back. They're not as dumb as they look. I hung up, staring at the ceiling. They weren't dumb. Now, Margaret's parting shot had carried weight. She suspected something. Even if she couldn't name it, let her dig. She'd find nothing but the mask I'd worn for years. James, the nobody quiet husband full. The real me was a ghost in their world. And ghosts don't leave footprints. I poured another drink, the amber liquid catching the light like a promise. Tomorrow I'd sit at their table, eat their food, smile at their jokes. I'd be the man they wanted, meek, beaten, theirs to pity. While they preened, I'd be dismantling their lives, brick by brick until the ground beneath them turned to ash. They'd invited me to their game, but I'd rewrite the rules and they'd never see it coming. The house smelled of rain and regret, the kind of damp that seeps into your bones and lingers. It was late afternoon, the sky outside a bruised gray that mirrored the storm brewing inside these walls. I stood by the kitchen counter, a mug of coffee cooling in my hands. Its bitterness, a faint echo of the words I was about to unleash. Elena bustled in from the garage, her arms full of grocery bags, organic kale, artistical bread, the trappings of a life she thought we still shared. She hadn't spoken much since the brunch yesterday, where I played my part to perfection, the subdued husband nodding at their jokes, swallowing their pity like a bitter pill. They locked it up, oblivious to the news tightening around them. "James, can you grab the milk?" she called, her voice bright but strained, a string about to snap. I set the mug down and moved to help my silence louder than her chatter. She unpacked with mechanical precision, avoiding my eyes. She knew something was off. Al had known since I'd walked out of that wedding reception, but she convinced herself it could be smoothed over with time and groceries. She was wrong. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "We need to talk." Her hand stilled a jar of honey hovering mid-air. She set it down slowly, turning to face me, her freckles stark against the power of her cheeks. "About what?" she asked. But the tremor in her voice said she already knew. "About your family," I said, keeping my tone flat, a blade sheath for now. "About where you stand?" She frowned, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "What do you mean?" "Told you last night was a mistake. They apologized. You were there at brunch?" "Stop it, Elena." My voice cut through hers, sharp enough to make her flinch. "They didn't apologize because they're sorry. They came because they think I'm weak. You let them. You asked me to gravel to your mother after she spat on me in front of everyone. That's not a mistake, it's a choice." Her mouth opened, closed eyes starting like a trapped animal's. "I didn't mean it like that. I just wanted peace, James, for us, peace." I stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to a chasm of unsaid truths. "There's no peace when your mother calls me a beggar, and you stand there begging me to kiss her ring. Where were you when she humiliated me? Where is your spine?" She recoiled, her hands gripping the counter behind her. "That's not fair. She's my mother. Can't just cut her off. They're my family. And your husband?" A shot back, the word heavy with 3 years of quiet sacrifices she'd never seen. Or was I just the shadow? "You let them step on?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't soften, couldn't, not now. A memory flashed, our first date. Her laughing as we shared a soggy sandwich under a leaking awning. Rain streaking her face like tears. She'd been fearless, then untainted by her family's venom. I loved her for it, but that Elena was gone, buried under Margaret's shadow, and I was done mourning her. "I'm not choosing between you," she said, voice breaking. "I love you, James." "That then prove it." I straightened my gaze, locking hers in a vice. "Mirror them. Right now, no more half measures, no more excuses. You pick a side, Elena, or I walk out that door and don't come back." Her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. The kitchen clock ticked each second, a hammer striking nails into a coffin. I watched her wrestle with it, love, loyalty, fear, all warring behind those green eyes I'd once drowned in. She wiped her face with trembling hands, then whispered, "I choose you." The word should have felt like a victory. They were hollow, laced with pragmatism instead of passion. She wasn't choosing me because she believed in us. She was choosing me because she thought I'd break otherwise, that I'd crumble without her. She didn't know I'd already started tearing our world apart, piece by silent piece. I nodded, letting a flicker of relief cross my face. "It's enough to sell it." I said, softening my tone. We'll figure this out together. I stepped forward, pulling her into my arms, her head resting against my chest. She clung to me, her tears soaking my shirt, and I held her like nothing had changed, but everything had that night. While she slept upstairs, I sat in the dark of my study, the glow of my laptop casting a cold light across the room. Sarah had tested earlier, first transfers done. Boutique leases toast. Trevor's investors are jittery. I replied with a single word: more. My fingers flew across the keys, recruiting funds, shifting properties, burying my empire in layers of trusts and proxies. Only Sarah could unravel. Elaine, his name was nowhere near it, hers or her family's. They'd never touch a dime. Another memory crept in. Elaine, his father, drunk at a Christmas party 2 years ago, boasting about his legacy, while I quietly paid off his gambling debts to keep their mansion out of foreclosure. I'd done it for her back when I thought love Mick carrying their burdens. Now I saw it for what it was. A leash they'd slipped around my neck. When I'd worn too long, the floor creaked behind me. I closed the laptop just as Elena appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hall light. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice small. "Work," I lied, turning to face her. "Go back to bed. I'll be up soon." She hesitated, then nodded, shuffling away. I waited until her footsteps faded, then opened the laptop again. The screen glowed with a new email from Sarah. "Next batch ready? Say the word." I typed back, "Do it." The coffee was cold now, but I drank it anyway, the bitterness grounding me. Elena had chosen me, but it was too late. She'd sealed her fate the moment. She'd asked me about a Margaret tomorrow. Keep up the charade, breakfast together, smiles, promises of a fresh start. She believed it because she wanted to, because she couldn't imagine the man she'd married was a stranger now. And while she dreamed of reconciliation, I'd be stripping her world bare brick by brick until nothing remained. But the echo of her choice, the air in the city buzzed with the of a machine starting to break gears, grinding, bolts loosening, collapse. No one saw coming but me. It was a week after Elena's choice, and I sat in a corner booth at a diner nobody in her family would ever step foot in. The coffee was burnt, the vinyl seats cracked, but it was mine. A relic of the days when Sarah and I had clawed our way up from nothing. My phone lay face up on the table, a steady stream of text from Sarah lighting the screen. Boutique lease terminated, landlords moving new tenants in next week. Trevor's lead investor pulled out, panic setting in. I sipped the coffee, its accurate by the fitting match for the satisfaction curling in my chest. Pieces were falling. I was the invisible hand knocking them down. Elena had been clinging since the ultimatum, hovering like a moth around a flame. She didn't know it was rigged to burn her. Breakfasts were a performance. Now, her chattering about reconciliation, me nodding over pancakes I didn't taste. She thought we were healing. I let her. It kept her blind while I worked this morning. She'd kissed my cheek before heading to a yoga class, oblivious to the storm I'd unleashed by noon. First cracks would show, and I'd be there to watch them widen. I drove to the bank next, a nondescript branch where I'd parked millions under layers of aliases. The teller, a young guy with a nervous tick, didn't blink when I handed over instructions to shift another chunk of assets to Sarah's holding company. "Routine transfer," I said, and he nodded like it was nothing, though the numbers on the screen could have bought his life 10 times over outside. The wind whipped through the streets, carrying the faint scent of rain and ruin. My phone buzzed again. Sarah Clara's boutique staff just got eviction notices. She's freaking out, wanting to push harder. Type back, "Yes, hit Trevor next." Full collapse. The unraveling began in earnest that afternoon. I was at home pretending to read a book in the study, when Elena burst in her face, a mask of panic. "James, something's wrong. Clara just called me in tears. The boutique's lease is gone. They're locking her out tomorrow." I looked up, following my brow in feigned concern. "Gone? How does that happen?" "I don't know." She paced, her yoga leggings still damp with sweat. "She said the landlord wouldn't negotiate. Just send a notice and that was it. She's losing everything. Her inventory, her clients, and Trevor's a mess too. Some investor bailed on a startup. It's like everything's falling apart at once." I set the book down, leaning forward. "That's rough. Did they say why?" "No. It's all vague. Business decisions, market shifts. Clara thinks someone's targeting them." "That's crazy, right?" Her eyes searched mine, desperate for reassurance. I gave her a slow nod, my face a perfect mask of sympathy. "Sounds like bad luck." I said, "Maybe it'll blow over." She didn't buy it, not fully. Her fingers twisted together, that old tick, flaring under stress. "It's too much at once. Mom's freaking out. She's calling everyone she knows to figure this out. Let me know if I can help," I said, standing to pull her into a hug. She melted against me, her breath shaky. "We'll get through it." The lie slid out smooth as silk, and she clung to it, blind to the puppet strings I'd already pulled. By evening the chaos had spread. I drove to Margaret's sprawling estate. Elena's insistence a family meeting to regroup. The mansion loomed against the darkening sky, its manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the disarray inside. Clara sat on a velvet sofa, mascara streaking her face as she clutched a glass of wine. Trevor paced by the fireplace, his phone pressed to his ear, barking at someone who wasn't listening. Margaret reined from an armchair, her blazer swapped for a silk robe, but her eyes were sharp, predatory sabotage. Clara solved. "Someone's doing this to us. Don't be dramatic," Margaret snapped, though her voice lacked its usual steel. "Businesses fail, will recover." Trevor whirled on her, his face red. "My startup's dead. 3 investors gone in a day. Not a coincidence." I linger by the doorway, hands in my pockets, the quiet observer they'd always dismissed. Elena sat beside Clara, murmuring comfort while I catalogued their weaknesses. Clara's boutique was just the start. Sarah had already lined up creditors to call in Trevor's loans, and Margaret Charity was next. Its donors about to get anonymous tips about mismanaged fonts. They'd feel the squeeze, but they'd never trace it to me. Not yet. Margaret's gaze landed on me. Narrowing. "James," she said, tone clip, "you're awfully quiet. Any thoughts?" I shrugged, keeping my voice smiled. "Sounds like a rough patch. I'm sure you'll figure it out." "You always do." Her lips pursed suspicion, flickering in those cold eyes. "We've weathered worse family sticks together." "Always," I agreed, meeting her stare with a faint smile. She didn't blink, and for a moment I wondered if she sensed the trap closing. Then Trevor swore at his phone and her attention snapped away. I slipped out to the porch, the night air cool against my skin, and checked my messages. "Sarah Charity donors spooked. 2 pulled funding tonight. They're crumbling." I typed back, "Keep going. No mercy." The door creaked behind me. Trevor stepped out, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. "Hell of a day," he muttered, exhaling smoke. "You believe this crap?" "Hard to," I said, leaning against the railing. "Almost feels personal." He froze the cigarette halfway to his mouth. "You think so too?" I shrugged again, planting the seed. "Who wanna hurt you all like this?" He stared at me and shook his head. "No clue, but if I find out," he trailed off, flicking ash into the dark. I didn't push, just let the paranoia take root. Inside, Clara's sobs grew louder, Margaret's voice rising to drown them out. The machine was breaking. I was the ghost turning, the screws driving home. Elena was quiet, her hands knotted in her lap. "They're scared," she whispered. "I've never seen them like this." "They'll bounce back," allied my eyes on the road. "They always do." They wouldn't, not this time. Sarah and I had built an empire on patience and shadows. Now we use it to bury them. The unraveling had begun. And I'd watch it burn to the ground piece by precious piece. The days bled into weeks, each one a thread in the tapestry of ruin. I wove around Elena and her family. October had settled over the city like a shroud, crisp bare leaves crunching underfoot, the world shedding its skin while I shed mine. The house felt like a stage now. Every room is set for the performance I perfected. James, the husband, steady and forgiving, a prop, and Elena's fragile hope. She clung to me harder as her family crumbled. Her smiles brittle, her touch desperate, played along my mask seamless while behind it I dismantled everything she knew. Mornings were a ritual of lies. I'd wake early, brew coffee, and sit at the kitchen table with a newspaper. I didn't read, letting her chatter fill the silence. Today was no different. She shuffled in, wrapped in a robe that hung loose on her thinning frame. Stress had carved hollows under her eyes. Older auburn hair. "Claire is moving in with Mom tomorrow," she said, pouring tea with hands that trembled slightly. "The boutique's gone. She's selling what's left online, but it's not enough." I folded the paper, setting it aside. "That's tough. She'll figure something out." "Elaine." His lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know, James. It's like the ground's falling out from under us." "Trevor's barely speaking. He's holed up in some cheap rental chasing investors who won't call back. Mom's charity gala got canceled. Donors keep dropping out. It's unnatural." I sipped my coffee, the bitterness of comfort. "Bad luck comes in waves. They'll pull through." She stared at me, searching for something reassurance, maybe, or a crack in my calm. "You really think so?" "Always have," I said, meeting her gaze with a steady warmth. I didn't feel she nodded, clinging to the lifeline. And I let her. She didn't see the text from Sarah lighting up my phone under the table. "Charity's toast. Last donor bailed. Trevor's loans called in, clocks ticking." I'd reply later when her back was turned. The facade held through dinners, 2 quiet meals where she'd pick at her food, counting the family's latest woes. I'd nod, offer platitudes, pour her wine. She had started drinking more, her laughter edged with something raw. "You're my rock, James," she said one night. Her hand squeezing mine across the table. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled, squeezed back, and said nothing. The irony was a blade in my gut, but I learned to live with its twist. Behind the scenes, I worked like a surgeon exercising a tumor. Late nights in the study, the glow of my laptop a cold companion. I finalized the last transfers, properties, beach houses, city lofts, the vineyard Elena loved but never knew I'd bought. Slipped into Sarah's name, buried in trust, no lawyer could untangle. Bank accounts drained into offshore havens, leaving just enough in our joint one to keep Elena from noticing. Sarah was a machine. Her updates, relentless, vineyards gone. Margaret, mortgage lenders sniffing around foreclosures. Next I type back, finish it. And she did. Cracks widened daily. Clara called one afternoon, her voice shrill through the speakerphone as Elena listened, pale. They took my car. Elena repossessed it right out of Mom's driveway. How am I supposed to live? Trevor startup folded the next day, a headline in the local paper. I left on the counter for Elena to find. Margaret Charity faced an audit, whispers of fraud circling like vultures. Elena cried herself to sleep most nights, her sobs muffled by the pillow. While I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, my heart is stone. I wasn't cruel, not outwardly. I'd hold her when she reached for me. Murmur comfort, she mistook for love. But inside I was a ghost attached, counting down. The final piece fell into place on a Thursday, air thick with the promise of rain. Sarah called while Elena was out. Her voice crisp, done. Everything is mine, legally, irreversibly. You're a pauper on paper. Good, I said, standing at the window, watching leaves spiral in the wind. Files ready, signed and sealed. Divorce papers are with the lawyer, drop them whenever you're set. Tomorrow she'd wait to the papers, the truth crashing down like a wave she couldn't outrun. She'd call, scream. I'd be gone, a shadow slipping through her fingers. The rain tapped the window, a steady rhythm to my thoughts. They lost everything, money, status, pride, and they still didn't know why. I kept the facade up long enough to watch them fracture, feel the weight of their arrogance turn to ash. Tomorrow the mask would fall and they'd see the man they dismissed. Tonight, I sat in the dark, the storm outside a mirror to the one I'd unleashed, and waited for the end. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a sterile arena where lives were dissected under fluorescent lights. I sat at the petitioner's table, hands folded, my plain gray-suited, deliberate contrast to the chaos about to erupt. Across the aisle, Elena hunched beside her lawyer, a wiry man with a cheap tie and a nervous tic. Her eyes were red, her auburn hair tangled, a far cry from the poised woman who had once dazzled the wedding crowd. Behind her, Margaret loomed in the gallery, her silk scarf a defiant splash of color. While Clara and Trevor flanked her, their faces drawn with a mix of fury and fear, the air crackled with anticipation, a storm ready to break. The judge, a stern woman with steel gray hair, tapped her gavel. Case number 4729, dissolution of marriage. James Carter versus Elena Carter. Counsel proceed. Elena's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, we're contesting the division of assets. Mr. Carter claims no property, but my client assert joint ownership of significant holdings, real estate, investments. A vineyard, no property. The judge interrupted, peering over her glasses at me. Mr. Carter, you're alleging indigenous in a marriage of 3 years. Arose my voice, calm, measured. That's correct. Your Honor, everything I had is gone, transferred legally before these proceedings. I've got nothing to divide. A murmur rippled through the room. Elaine, his head snapped up. Her eyes locking on mine, wide with disbelief. Her lawyer sputtered, that's preposterous. He's hiding assets, millions. We suspect, we demand discovery, bank records, the works. The judge raised an eyebrow, turning to my counsel, a sharp-eyed woman Sarah had hired, all business in her tailored suit. Miss Hargrove. She stood, sliding a stack of papers across the bench. All transfers were completed months ago, Your Honor. Legal, notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities. My client owns nothing. No real estate, no accounts, not even a car in his name. Here's the documentation. The judge flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. Elena's lawyer lunged forward, voice rising. This is a sham. He's defrauded my client, moved everything to avoid a fair settlement. Prove it, I said, my tone low but cutting through the noise. All I swung to me and I met Elena's stare head on. Show me $1 I still control, you won't find it. Her lips trembled, then parted. James, what are you doing? Her voice cracked, plea wrapped in rage. You can't just. Where did it all go? The gallery buzzed, Margaret leaning forward, her knuckles white on the railing. I didn't answer, not yet. The judge banged her gavel. Order. Mr. Carter, explain these transfers. Who holds the assets now? Before I could speak, courtroom doors swung open, a sharp creak slicing the tension. Sarah strode in, her heels clicking with purpose. Dark hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She wore a black blazer that screamed power, her presence of thunderclap in the sterile row. I do, she said, her voice clear, unwavering. Sarah Carter, Mr. Carter's sister, the assets are mine, legally transferred over the past 6 months? Unprepared to testify, Elaine is lawyergate, papers slipping from his hands. Sister, this is collusion conspiracy. Prove it, Sarah shot back, her smile ablaze. She handed a folder to my lawyer, who passed it to the judge. Every transfer is documented, dates, signatures, witnesses. James wanted out, I took over, it's all above board. The judge scanned the documents, her expression unreadable. Elena stood, shaking, her voice rising to a shriek. You gave it all to her. Everything we built, the house, the vineyard, my life. I turned to her, my face a mask of calm. We didn't build anything, Elena. I did, and I took it back. Her hands flew to her mouth, a sob choking out. Margaret surged to her feet, her scarf slipping as she pointed at me. You snake. You've been playing us all along, ruining us while you hid behind this lie. The judge's gavel cracked again. Sit down, ma'am, or you'll be removed. Margaret sank back, her glare venomous, but I held her stare unflinching. Explain yourself, Carter, the judge said, tone sharp. This smells like a dodge. It's no dodge. I said, stepping forward. I built my wealth before and during the marriage quietly without her name on anything. When it became clear she valued her family's approval over me, protected what was mine, I transferred it to my sister, who's been my partner in every venture. It's legal. Check the dates. Most of it was gone before I filed. A memory flashed. Sarah and me in a dingy office signing our first deal. Her grin fears as we shook hands over a future they'd never touch. Elena's lawyer scrambled being through papers, but the fight was draining from him. The judge leaned back, rubbing her temples. This is unusual, but if the transfers predate the filing and comply with state law, can undo them. Mrs. Carter, your claim hinges on proving fraud. Do you have evidence? Elena's lawyer hesitated, then slumped. Not yet, Your Honor. We need time. You've had months, I said, cutting him off. You won't find anything. It's over. The judge sighed, scribbling notes. I'll review the documents, but absent clear fraud, I'm inclined to grant the dissolution with no asset division. Mrs. Carter keeps what's in her name. Mr. Carter apparently has nothing. Hearing adjourned, the gavel fell. A final thunderclap. Elena collapsed into her chair, sobbing, while Margaret stormed forward, only to be blocked by a bailiff. Clara and Trevor sat stunned, their world's ash. Sarah crossed to me, her hand brushing my shoulder. Well done, she whispered, then louder for them to hear, can never be part of us. The echo of Margaret's wedding barb hung in the air. A dagger turned back on them. Elaine, his eyes met mine one last time, hollow, betrayed. Why, she whispered. You chose them first, I said, soft but final. Turned away. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a slate of possibility. Sarah fell into step beside me, her grin wicked. They're done. Foreclosure's hitting Margaret next week. Clara and Trevor broke. You pulled it off. I nodded, the weight of victory settling in my chest. Sharp-edged and cold courtroom faded behind us, their cries swallowed by the wind. I'd won, stripped and bare. But as we walked to the car, Elena's broken white lingered. A ghost. I couldn't quite shake the cafe set tucked on a cliffside road, a weathered shack overlooking a sea that churned gray and restless under a November sky. A driven 2 hours from the city to find it. Drawn by the promise of solitude and the tang of salt air. A balm for a victory that felt heavier than I'd expected. The wooden chair creaked under me as I sat by the window, a steaming mug of black coffee cradle in my hands. The place was near empty, just a grizzled fisherman nursing a beer at the counter, and a waitress humming off-key to a crackling radio. It was perfect, a nowhere spot where the world couldn't follow. The courtroom was 3 days behind me, its echoes fading like a storm passing out to sea. Sarah had called that morning, her voice bright with the glee of a hunter savoring the kill. Margaret House went to auction today, sold for peanuts. Player is hawking jewelry on some sketchy website, and Trevor's vanished, probably drowning in debt somewhere. You did it, James? They're ghosts, now. I grunted in acknowledgement, hung up and hit the road. She'd revel in the wreckage. I needed distance to feel it settled. Coffee burned my tongue, sharp and grounding outside. Waves crashed against jagged rocks, spraying mist that blurred the horizon. At once stripped and bare turned their arrogance dash. Margaret's venom, Elena's betrayal, Claire's entitlement, Trevor's bluster, all reduced to nothing. I'd walked away clean, my empire safe in Sarah's hands. My name a blank slate. It should have felt like freedom, and in a way it did. Cold, vast kind, the ocean stretching before me. There was an ache to a splendor I couldn't dig out. Elaine is why haunted me, a whisper threading through the wind's howl. I saw her face in the courtroom, shattered, hollow. The woman I had once loved reduced to a stranger's ruin. A memory crept in unbidden. Our second anniversary, a quiet night in a cabin, I bought as a surprise. She danced barefoot to some old jazz record, her laughter warm as the firelight, her hands pulling me into a clumsy sway. I'd promised her forever that night and meant it. Where had that Elena gone? Buried under Margaret's shadow? Maybe, or lost the moment she'd asked me to bow at that wedding. I'd never know that was the splinter's edge, sharp, buried deep. Fisherman coughed, breaking my reverie. I glanced at him, leather skin, eyes like the sea, a man who had weathered storms I'd never fathom. Did he carry ghosts too? I turned back to the window, tracing the coastline's curve. Sarah had asked me once years ago why I stayed quiet about our wealth. I don't need the spotlight, I'd said. She nodded, understanding. It was power to me, control, not display. I'd let Elena shine because it her suited us until it didn't. Now the spotlight was theirs to lose, and they've lost it all. My phone buzzed on the table. Sarah, again. I flipped it over on red. She'd want to plan the next move, expand the empire, turn our victory into a dynasty. She thrived on the game. I played it to win, then walk away. The transfers were done, my tracks erased. I was a ghost now too, in a way, free, untethered, a shadow slipping through the cracks of their world. The motel I'd crashed in after filing was a memory. I find a new place soon, somewhere small, untraceable, no mansions, no flash, just me, and the quiet I'd always craved. The waitress shuffled over, refilling my mug with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Rough day. She asked, her voice gravelly from years of smoke or shouting. Rough year, I said, and she chuckled, leaving me to my solitude. Coffee steamed anew to heat a small comfort. I thought of Margaret's last glare in the courtroom. Venom turned impotent. Players' sobs, Trevor's collapse, Uppets cut from strings I'd held, and Elena broken by a choice she hadn't seen coming. I'd taken everything, not out of greed but justice, our reckoning for the night. They tried to bury me. They'd never know the full scope, never trace the boutiques fall, the charities ruin, the loans called in. That was the beauty of it. Perfect invisible strike. But had I gone too far? Question not, uninvited. Clara's kid, a nephew I'd met once. All sticky fingers and shy grins, would grow up in the fallout. Did he deserve the rubble? I'd left. I pushed the thought down, sipping the coffee. They made their bed, all of them. When they had sneered at me from that gilded stage, I just pulled the sheets tight. The radio crackled, a new snippet cutting through. Local heiress, Margaret Langston loses estate in shocking foreclosure. I smirked, faint and fleeting. The world would move on, their names fading to whispers, then silence. Mine would too. By design, Sarah would carry the torch. I trusted her to wield it. Me, I'd vanish a shadow's edge against the light. The sea roared relentless and I leaned back, letting it fill the silence. Victory was mine, cold and complete, but that splinter remained. Elena's laugh, touch a life I'd burned to the ground. Was it worth it? The waves didn't answer. And neither did I. You finished the coffee, left a crumpled 20 on the table and stepped into the wind. The cafe door swung shut behind me, the sound swallowed by the storm. I walked into the gray, a ghost at peace with the shadows I'd cast. That's the end of the story. But what do you think? Did James play the perfect game of revenge? Or did he lose something in the shadows he can't get back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm reading everyone. If this tale of betrayal and triumph hooked you, smash that like button, subscribe and ring the bell, so you don't miss my next audio story. See you in the next story.